So this was one of the bases of their perceptions. Now, also with region, I found that the most salient aspect of it was the categorization of speech as either local or non-local. Also with that, people basically, they would recognize speech, whether they would hear it or just hear it in their mind. They'd recognize speech as belonging to their own speech area, or even one that they were very intimately associated with, or not their area. It was kind of in the contrast of us versus them as far as speech was concerned. Now, people are used to region as a category attached to other sets of information in the United States. It's a big country, and we often use region to discuss different issues. For example, the weather, politics, lots of issues. We divide the country into regions, and this is the way we discuss. Through categories, we're able to discriminate between large amounts of information. Categories make knowledge manageable. This is a cognitive aspect. This is how we think. Think about phone numbers, for an example. You know, we don't memorize all 7 or 10 numbers at once. We put them into chunks. This is how we access information. So we commonly rely on categories, and specifically in the United States, we commonly rely on region as a category. And therefore, it's not really surprising that this idea of area or region plays a role in folk linguistic knowledge. Now, specifically looking at region and Southern speech, the South is a main standard region that is commonly referred to. I saw it in my study. All the other studies that we've talked about in this session have proven the same thing. Maybe it's because the South stands out for historical reasons. You know, we're talking about language, but there are other reasons that come into effect here too. Different history, maybe different climate, different societal focus, different religious beliefs, political beliefs, what have you. But it makes the South stand out as a separate entity. The South, as an entity or as a category, comes out in respondent mass, much more so than any other region. And it's the only folk dialect region in which, in my study, the states were consistently sorted together geographically. All the other regions were kind of scattered. The South always was kind of a cohesive region for my respondents. Now, Southern speech is described by respondents commonly as local or not local, but always different from that found in the rest of the country. We just heard this discussed by Lamont. In my study, I found that Georgia respondents would talk about speech. For example, where I'm from, people speak different than the rest of the country, solidifying the South, us from them. The people I interviewed from New Jersey said, where I'm from, we don't speak like they do down there. So again, they separated the South out. One of the things that I'd like to point out is Johnstone in 2000 talks about viewing place, this idea of place, not just as a function of geography, but as a cultural entity in itself. And I believe this is what we're seeing here. All right, now I want to talk about perceptions and the social attributes. Language is viewed as a function of cooperative society. This is the strongest category I found in my study. It comes through in a lot of different ways, but basically, people believe language is a function of society. This is how they see it. We may talk about language in terms of morphemes and phonemes. People see language as society. Social ideas are at the forefront of our cognitive knowledge about language. When people describe speech, they habitually use social terms that relate positive information. Negative choices are used only for stigmatized speech. The main subsets of the societal category of language is, one is well-spoken, whether or not a person is considered to be, or an area or a group or a speech style is considered to be well-spoken. This can be standard language, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't necessarily come out in terms of correct or incorrect. The other aspect is good or bad language. Now, when I mean good or bad language, again, I'm not talking about correct or incorrect, but people look at this in terms of whether or not if the way of speaking is socially acceptable or if it's deviant behavior. People talk about speech in terms of whether or not it's socially acceptable. So language is used as a judgment as to whether or not the speaker will be a good interlocutor. In other words, when you hear or think about somebody's speech, you decide whether or not you actually want to have a conversation with this person. This is the type of information that to most people is what language reveals. Friendly, nice, pleasant were the most common terms of all the terms that I used, all 13 triplets, I should say. These three were the most commonly used. And what I found was that respondents consistently chose positive or negative terms to describe language, even though a neutral choice was available. They went one way or the other, and they only used the negative choice if it was stigmatized speech or something that really stood out, and it usually was in the terms of whether or not they found that speech to be well spoken. Okay. So the social descriptions of Southern speech. The Southern states had the most definitive responses associated with them, by far, out of all the other. New York and New Jersey came in second, but definitely it was Southern states that had the most focus. The views of Georgia were the only ones to show a fully clear statistical consensus, but the South was definitely a larger group. Now, the South, and specifically, well, the South and Georgia were described as attractive, honest, friendly, nice, pleasant, polite, trustworthy, and incorrect, lazy, and unintelligent. So here we see it's socially good. You still want to talk to these people. It's still a good, socially acceptable part of language. The speech is still stigmatized. The next key category I found was personal experience. Now, all other categories filtered through personal experience. For example, when we're talking about region, whether or not it's local or not local depends on who the person is that's doing the hearing or the experiencing. Whether or not the person is linguistically secure or insecure can affect the judgment as good or bad language. One thing to note is different people have different perceptions, but the perceptions are always determined by the same categories. They're still in terms of region, social acceptability, personal experience, and linguistics, or actual language features. They're always the same categories, but different people recognize these in different terms. They may access different bits of information associated with them. Now, we all know variation is a natural part of speech. Therefore, it's perfectly natural to also find variability in the perceptions of language. Quoting LaBeouf, Libby Green writes, heterogeneity is an integral part of the linguistic economy of the community. It's necessary to satisfy the linguistic demands of everyday life.